There is a detail in this crisis that many people still do not fully see, and it changes the entire reading of what is happening between the United States, Iran, and China. While the official discourse speaks of punishing Tehran and suffocating its oil machine, the real movement behind the scenes is far more contradictory than it first appears. The United States has continued imposing new sanctions against the chain that brings Iranian oil into the Chinese market, targeting intermediaries, vessels, and companies tied to that flow. Yet at the same time, Trump said he had spoken with Xi Jinping about the possibility of easing sanctions against Chinese companies that buy that very same oil. That combination is the starting point of the entire story, and it is precisely this contradiction that makes the case so explosive. On one side, Washington tries to appear firm, tightening pressure on Iran and on any company that helps move its oil. On the other, the American president himself leaves open the possibility of flexibility when the conversation involves China, which is now the main destination for Iranian oil. Politically, this may look like a betrayal of the sanctions. Strategically, it reveals something even more important. Sanctions have stopped being only punishment and have become a bargaining tool. What makes this even more curious is that this dispute is not happening in a vacuum. It is unfolding amid a war and a regional tension that have already begun affecting the global energy market. Every new sanction, every threat, every sign of retreat moves prices, shipping routes, and the risk perception of governments and investors. In other words, what looks like a bilateral quarrel is, in practice, shaking the entire machinery of the world economy. Iran remains at the center of that machinery. Even under sanctions, the country still finds ways to export oil through indirect routes and intermediary networks. That shows that the American blockade did not eliminate the flow. It simply pushed it into a gray zone, where trade still exists but under a different form. And it is exactly in that gray zone that China becomes the main actor. Beijing does not behave like an accidental buyer. China treats Iranian oil as a strategic piece of its energy security. When Washington tightens the noose, Beijing responds, protects its companies, and tries to prevent American sanctions from becoming a precedent against its own commercial sovereignty. That turns the crisis into something bigger than a dispute over Iran. It is now a struggle over China's freedom of action in the face of the United States. And this is where the script gains narrative power. The audience is not just watching sanctions. It is watching a power struggle in which every word can move markets, every measure can create diplomatic pressure, and every retreat can alter the course of negotiation. The oil war has stopped being only an economic war. It has become a test of how far Trump is willing to go before admitting that, on the real board, China cannot be ignored. When the United States announces new sanctions against Iranian oil, the public image is that of an ever-tightening noose. But looking more closely, what appears is a system of pressure that tries to hit not only Iran, but the entire chain that allows oil to leave the country and reach the Chinese market. That includes ships, shell companies, refineries, and intermediaries spread across different regions. The logic is simple in theory and very hard in practice. Cut off the money flow that sustains Iranian resistance. Yet recent experience shows that this kind of pressure rarely produces an immediate collapse. What usually happens is adaptation. Routes are reorganized, companies change names, contracts become more opaque, and the oil keeps moving, even if through more dangerous paths. The result is a kind of underground trade that does not disappear under sanctions. It simply becomes harder to track. That weakens the idea that American punishment alone can freeze the Iranian economy. This reality exposes a deeper problem for Washington. The more the United States tries to strangle the flow, the more it depends on the cooperation or restraint of countries like China. And China does not seem willing to bear the cost of passively obeying. On the contrary, Beijing has made it clear that it will defend its companies and reduce the reach of American sanctions. In other words, the blockade only works fully if the other side agrees to play by Washington's rules. And that is exactly the part that fails. Trump seems to understand this. That is why his posture mixes pressure and political calculation. While reinforcing sanctions, he also admits to speaking with Xi about easing restrictions on Chinese companies involved in buying Iranian oil. That suggests the punishment is not an end in itself. It serves as a tool to open room for bargaining, and when that happens, sanctions stop being only an economic weapon and become a diplomatic message. I can tighten the pressure, but I can also loosen it if the deal is good enough. The problem is that this kind of game comes with a cost. Every new sanction affects markets, raises uncertainty, and pushes investors toward more defensive scenarios. Oil reacts immediately when the perception grows that Middle East tensions may rise, and that creates a dilemma. The more the United States tries to control the crisis through sanctions, the more it contributes to the volatility it claims to want to prevent. This is the essential background for understanding the depth of the crisis. Iranian oil has become a kind of test of the effectiveness of American policy. If sanctions do not stop the flow, they need to be reinforced. If reinforcement triggers a Chinese reaction, the cost rises. If the cost rises too much, the temptation to negotiate appears. It is a cycle that feeds itself, and precisely for that reason, this case is far more than another headline about Iran. It exposes the real limits of American power in the face of a global economy that no longer obeys unilateral orders with ease. China does not appear in this story as a background player. It stands at the center of the conflict and, in a way, explains why the issue became so large. Iranian oil is attractive to Beijing not only because of its price, but because of the energy security it provides in an increasingly unstable international environment. In a world where strategic routes can be threatened and access to supply becomes a matter of survival, securing an alternative source of oil is more than convenience. It is state planning. That is why every American sanction against Chinese companies or against the flow of Iranian oil is received in Beijing as an indirect attack. The response does not come only in statements. It comes in concrete measures to protect companies and preserve purchasing autonomy. The Chinese logic is clear. The United States cannot alone dictate who buys from whom and under what conditions. If it did, it would be setting a dangerous precedent for its own global position. At the same time, China does not want to appear responsible for a chaotic escalation. That is why it tries to present itself as a defender of regional stability and of uninterrupted energy flow. This balance is delicate. Beijing needs the oil, but it also needs to avoid the crisis turning into a greater shock in the global market. So the Chinese posture combines resistance to sanctions, protection of economic interests, and a discourse of moderation. China's role also helps explain why Trump's remarks about easing sanctions receive so much attention. If the problem were only Iran, the American line would be simpler. But when the central buyer is China, the issue stops being punishment and becomes strategic negotiation. This is where the most tense aspect enters. Trump seems willing to turn sanctions into bargaining chips precisely with the country Washington most wants to pressure in the long term. For Iran, this relationship is vital. Tehran knows that as long as Chinese demand exists, there will still be space for economic survival. The country may be under blockade, but it is not truly isolated. That difference is enormous. It means sanctions have not erased Iran's presence in the market. They have only made that presence more opaque, more politicized, and more dependent on indirect alliances. In short, China keeps alive what Washington tries to weaken. This triangulation is what gives the narrative depth. We are not facing a linear conflict, with one side attacking and the other simply resisting. We are facing three forces that constantly adjust to one another. The United States applies pressure. China absorbs and responds. Iran adapts and survives. And in the middle of it all, Trump tries to turn conflict into leverage for negotiation. That is the political heart of the story. Whenever this dispute intensifies, the global market feels it before it fully understands the cause. The Middle East remains far too sensitive for the energy sector, and any sign of instability there immediately affects prices, freight, supply expectations, and international confidence. When Trump said the ceasefire with Iran was on life support, markets reacted because they knew what that meant: more risk, more tension, and less predictability. This impact is not just financial. It affects how governments calculate security, how companies plan logistics, and how import-dependent economies adjust their strategy. In this setting, oil works as a thermometer of the international order. When it rises during a crisis, the message is clear. The system has entered a warning zone. The Strait of Hormuz is a symbol of that vulnerability. Any threat to safe passage through that region reverberates through global trade. That is why China watches everything so closely and insists on stability. For Beijing, a greater escalation is not just a diplomatic risk. It is a material risk to the energy supply on which its economy depends. And when that happens, geopolitics stops being abstract and starts affecting the economic lives of billions of people. Iran knows how to use this sensitivity to its advantage. Even under harsh sanctions, it continues to export oil and maintain a degree of market influence. That is not a technical detail. It is proof of strategic resilience. The country shows that it can still have an impact beyond its borders, even when the American goal is to reduce it to isolation. That is why each new round of pressure does not end the crisis. It only changes its form. Trump, at the same time, seems to oscillate between force and pragmatism. He reinforces the rhetoric of toughness, but leaves the door open for a possible review of sanctions against Chinese companies. In an ordinary crisis, that might sound like contradiction. Here, it sounds like adaptation. He needs to appear firm toward Iran, but also needs to deal with the reality that China cannot be ignored. And when politics has to respect economics, pure rhetoric loses space. The depth of this phase lies precisely in revealing that no power controls the game alone. The United States still has pressure power, but cannot determine every outcome. China still buys and protects its interests, but also depends on stability. Iran still resists, but its survival depends on increasingly narrow openings. The result is an unstable balance in which everyone tries to avoid collapse while keeping the dispute alive. In the end, what this story reveals is not just an exchange of accusations between Washington, Tehran, and Beijing. It reveals the limits of power when it tries to impose itself on a global network of interests that no longer follows a simple logic. Iranian oil keeps circulating, China keeps buying, the United States keeps sanctioning, and Trump keeps alternating between public toughness and the possibility of strategic accommodation. That is precisely the combination that makes the story seem so contradictory and, at the same time, so real. The strongest way to read all of this is to understand that sanctions have stopped being only a punishment tool. They have become a language of negotiation. When Trump admits he may ease restrictions on Chinese companies buying Iranian oil, he is not simply backing down. He is showing that American pressure now depends on exchange, calculation, and mutual interest. That turns foreign policy into a kind of permanent negotiation, where the threat matters as much as the deal. For Iran, that ambiguity is a chance for survival. For China, it is an opportunity to keep securing energy without accepting automatic subordination. For the United States, it is recognition that not every sanction produces the intended effect. And for Trump, it is a delicate political test, because he needs to look strong without closing the door to the kind of negotiation that could yield greater advantage on the global board. War, in this context, does not appear only as armed conflict. It emerges as market pressure, root competition, economic threat, and narrative instrument. That is why this subject is so compelling. It blends presidential decisions, national survival, energy prices, and superpower competition, all at once. And when that happens, the story gains a density that goes far beyond the headline. That is the true strength of the documentary you want to build. It is not just about showing that Trump is changing position. It is about showing that he is operating inside a system where absolute firmness no longer works by itself. Iran keeps challenging. China keeps resisting. The market keeps reacting. And the United States keeps trying to impose limits on a flow that insists on escaping through other routes. In the end, what remains is a question far more interesting than the direct accusation of betrayal. The question is whether Trump is really abandoning his sanctions or whether he is doing something more sophisticated and colder, using the sanctions themselves as a bargaining chip to measure how far he can go with China without losing control of the narrative. And that is the kind of hook that keeps any documentary alive until the very last second.